Hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host, and today I've got an exciting episode with Dr. Connie Zweig. And today we talk about meeting the shadow on the spiritual path. And I want to introduce her, get to a couple of housekeeping details, and then just get started. So first, her bio. Dr. Connie Zweig is a retired therapist and co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. It won the 2022 Gold COVR Award and the 2022 Gold Nautilus Award, the 2021 American Book Fest Award, and the 2021 Best Indie Book Award for Inspirational Nonfiction. Her new book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening, is available now. Connie's been doing contemplative practice for more than 50 years. She's a wife, stepmother, and grandmother. After all these roles, she's practicing the shift from role to soul. And you can reach her at Connie Zweig, ConnieZweig.com. Check her out. I have been in love in her work for a long time, and I've been using her books, certainly on shadow. She speaks so beautifully on these concepts. So thanks a lot, Connie, for coming onto the podcast, and thanks for your support here, and thanks for what you do, contributing to the world. So also be sure to share The Sacred Speaks. Check it out at thesacredspeaks.com. Also check it out on Instagram and share, like, do whatever you can to support the cause. Our sponsor is the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences, a boutique integrative clinic or wellness practice that my wife and I started many years ago. We've got a number of clinicians, all kinds of offerings, all kinds of groups. I'm including some new offerings in men's work. So I want to note that really quickly because the next episode on The Sacred Speaks is with Father Richard Rohr. It'll be the second time I interviewed the good Father Rohr, and the first time was episode 91. Speaking of which, the first time I interviewed Connie was episode 74, just for the record. And one of the things I'm doing on the podcast is moving into an exploration of the masculine. So I'll do about 4 or 5 episodes on the masculine, and then about 4 or 5 episodes on the feminine. You'll get a lot of really cool people I'm lining up. So I'm excited about this next series because I'm diving into the book that I'm writing. I've just finished my outline, and now I've got some really solid direction for where I'm going. So hang on tight. It's going to be a good ride coming up. So also check out esalen.org, ESALEN.org, and Rodney Waters and I, who's also been on the podcast, will be leading a workshop coming up October 23rd through 27th, so pardon me if you're watching this after that time. The workshop is on Portals and Pathways, Ecstatic Experience, Music, and Jung's Red Book. And we dive deep. There's a lot of music performances. There are some alternate states that are induced through music and ecstatic experience, and we certainly support that with a lot of content from our Jungian tradition and beyond. So come on out to Esalen if you're around, October 23rd through the 27th. Also check out the Jung Center at junghouston.org, JUNGHOUSTON.org. We just hosted Anthony Ray Hinton, who has a fantastic book called The Sun Does Shine, and that was an incredibly moving depiction of one of the most horrendous experiences I can possibly imagine. Also, John Temple. This is kind of cool. He's doing Temenos Dream. Check him out at temenosdream.com or check the project out. It is an app he's got. The Temenos Dream is TEMENOSDREAM, and he's got an episode online with Laura London, speaking with Laura. And his app is essentially all you need to have to document and engage your dreams. You speak into the app, it amplifies various symbols, and it also uses AI to produce an image. It's very powerful. Check it out. He's offering some specials right now, so go check him when you can. And also, of course, check out Modern Nations, modernnationsmusic.com. They've produced the theme song for this podcast I've been using since it started. Song called Clouds that you can hang out until the end of the episode and hear the full selection. It's a beautiful song, and I'm grateful for all the folks that contributed to that incredible work. So for now, I believe that's it. Be sure to like and share The Sacred Speaks. Thanks for joining. Look forward to an episode with Richard Rohr in a few weeks where we talk about his book, Quest for the Grail. It's a fantastic conversation, and I am, if you saw from the first interview, totally taken with his work. So I'm looking forward to getting that out there. For now, enjoy Dr. Connie Zweig, and we'll leave it there. Connie Zweig, you and I have a bit of a history. I was just sharing with you how much I love it when we pop up on each other's radar screens. And meeting this shadow on the spiritual path is your latest book. And as I was saying, it's really exciting to be reading this because I'm contemplating a lot of these ideas. It felt pretty serendipitous for you to be releasing this now. I dove in hard, so I'm eager to explore this idea with you, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just for the benefit of any listener or viewer, would you introduce yourself a bit, give us the rundown, and talk a little bit about just this book as an idea and its importance? And then I've got a list of questions to jump into, so we'll mine the
Okay.
territory together.
Okay, great.
Good.
So, I started meditation at age 19, very eager and naive. Um, Actually, not for any holy reason, but because I wanted to date a guy in Berkeley who wouldn't go out with me unless I did TM.
Sounds holy.
Yeah, 1968, probably. So, I really had a beautiful experience in the first few years with doing meditation. My mind quieted and my anger dissipated. It was really interesting and thrilling to me. And so I became a TM teacher.
Hmm.
And after a few years, I started to notice that there were changes going on in the organization where it had been quite open and then it started to become more hierarchical. Um, there was more and more money charged to get new practices. And there was some hypocrisy going on where Maharishi, the teacher, claimed to be celibate, but was having sex with women. And those rumors were kind of leaking out little by little.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually in 1979, I left the TM organization and started a journalism career and then a career in book publishing. And then I went back to grad school and got my doctorate in Jungian psychology and came out with Meeting the Shadow, which was an anthology of writings by experts about the dark side of human nature.
Great
I didn't
book, by the
really
way.
have a, yeah, I didn't have a plan to build a career in the shadow. I mean, it just kind of happened that way. It unfolded. And then I wrote Romancing the Shadow, which
Mm-hmm.
was sort of the method that I developed for working with our unconscious material in relationships. Why do we keep having the same fight over and over again? Why do we criticize each other? Why do we sabotage our intimacy?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Addiction, depression, and anxiety, and so on. And then I wrote a book called The Holy Longing, which was this topic about spiritual yearning for transcendence, for the divine, what we now call non-duality, for higher states. And then in my 60s, I wanted to look at the unconscious process around aging and retirement. And there was nothing, there was no book that looked at um, what are the shadows that we are carrying with us as we move into the later stage of life, whether it's the inner ageist and the way that we've internalized ageism and then shame ourselves for getting old, whether it's the doer that keeps us working because we're just so used to being the doer and identifying with that. And so these shadow issues keep us from the spiritual purpose of age, which is to shift our identity from role, from what we do, to soul, who we really are. And then my publisher said, why don't we come out with a revised edition of The Holy Longing, because so much has happened since then. And I had learned so much in the intervening decades about shadow and spirituality. And so Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path really explores what happens when we meet a part of ourselves that we're unaware of, that's a blind spot, and what happens when we're drawn to a charismatic teacher who also has shadow issues. And when those projections, those shadows meet in a discipleship or a devotional relationship, and the community around it, what are the shadows of the group? And so I wanted to kind of apply depth psychology to understand those dynamics. And as I started researching it, I was just shocked at how many scandals there are now currently going on, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Hindu, Vedanta or Advaita or shamanism or Buddhism, whatever the denomination, the same dynamics are playing out in the psychology of the people. And, so I wanted to give some guidance. There was no guidance for me when I left my community. And it was really painful and it was isolating. And I know that many people are going through that experience now, trying to decide whether to leave a teacher, whether to speak up in a group, and all of the loss that goes along with that separation. And so I wanted to give some guidance to people who are struggling with this dilemma. And that's what Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path is about.
Awesome. And it is good. And we'll talk a little bit about why, as I was telling you when we first started chatting today, not only is it a fantastic read, but it's hitting me in a particular place right now, given some work that I'm doing for my own intellectual kind of process, and spiritual process. So we'll get into that a little bit too if we have the time. But I want to dive into this a little bit and talk about this idea of holy longing and what you think that is. What are people seeking? What's the nature of this? Let's dive in there.
You know, saints and poets throughout time have spoken about the soul's yearning for the beloved, right?
Yeah.
There's a part of us that is restless for more, that whispers to us, there's got to be more than this, more than the material world, more than the mind, more than the body, more than romance. And some of us intuit this from a young age. And it creates a kind of restlessness in us. And some people imagine that the object of their longing is a romantic partner. And then they project that onto their partner in a relationship to be the perfect ideal. And some people imagine it, the object of our longing is home. And they wander and they search for the perfect home, or in Islam, it's paradise. We imagine that there's an ideal that we call home. And many people imagine it as a level of consciousness. So we yearn for enlightenment or awakening or non-duality. And we project onto that all of these dreams and fantasies. And if that dream and projection lands on a human person, a man or woman who is a clergy person or a religious leader or a spiritual teacher, and that person is all too human, and he or she has a shadow, maybe authoritarian tendencies or narcissistic traits or sexual unfulfilled needs. And we are imagining that that person is a perfect parent or a complete divine human, then we're going to go into shock when we see their fallibility, when they act out in harmful ways. And some people will feel betrayed, and some people will actually experience PTSD. So, whatever the denomination, the same psychological dynamics are taking place. And it was interesting to me to look for patterns and to try to understand, the patterns of behavior across the different traditions and psychologically why this is happening.
Mm-hmm. So you said all too human, and the thing that I was thinking there, because you did such a great job in treating different theories, whether it's psychoanalytic or Jungian or even Ken Wilber's process, you're looking for these various lenses through which we can see and understand these energies that are uh, communicated, in between us and amongst us. And so often the all too humanness part of a leader is denied. It's not even, it's just, we want so much. And this is where I think it's powerful. We want so much for this divine like energy to be fulfilled in real time that we don't listen to the little whispers in our in our conscience. And you've got a ton of stories about this. Can you go into some of the stories where you see these communities that are people are participating in and they're not really paying attention to the signs of some of this conflict happening in their leader?
Yeah, so there's the whisper of the soul for that's longing for transcendence or higher consciousness. And then there are the whispers of the shadow that, right? I wanted to just differentiate that when you use that word. Those gut instincts or intuitions, when we are aware, oh, there's danger here. I don't want to look.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be true, right? So two different levels of whisper here that we're talking about in terms of our internal messaging and our capacity for self-observation. And so if we're used to meditation, for example, and watching our minds and able to detect when there's a message of danger, a red flag, a risky situation. Some people will experience that in the body as a gut reaction. Some people will experience it as a feeling of fear or anxiety. Some people will hear an internal message. I got to get out of here, right? And those three dimensions are cues that a shadow character is coming forward into consciousness, mental, emotional, and physical cues, that there is a part of you bringing information to you that you may not want to see. And the first response typically to a shadow coming into awareness is denial.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to know. And so when I interviewed people in the Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche community, Shambhala, they would say, he's not alcoholic. He can't be alcoholic. He can't be that brilliant and that enlightened and be an alcoholic. And even if he is, I don't want to know because my life is here. I'm invested. This is who I am. Their identity is there. And so even when Trungpa died of alcoholism, people denied it. They could not allow that information to penetrate. And then, he appointed an heir, and that man, and Trungpa also sexually assaulted women.
Mm.
And his heir continued that of having sex with students, even though he knew that he had HIV/AIDS. And he gave it to several people who died of AIDS. And when the third person, who was the biological son of the original teacher, took over, he also continued sexually assaulting people until he actually was forced out of the country and had to move. I think he went to Nepal. So three traditions here, three generations, intergenerational shadow material. And people now are really continuing to wrestle with the trauma of that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be meeting with people in the Shambhala community. The same thing, I just met with a group of people in the TM community who are now wrestling with new sex scandals that are coming out about Maharishi that hadn't come out before. And they're so traumatized because their picture of him was so idealized. He was a monk. He said he was a monk, so that can't be happening. He would never lie. He was a world teacher. The knowledge was so precious. the technique is so helpful. So that can't be. And so if the denial lasts for decades and someone is so identified with being a devotee of that teacher and a member of the community, then it's very painful to break through the denial. We saw that happening. There's a documentary of Rajneesh or Osho called Wild
Mm-hmm.
Wild Country. It was
Great
on
show.
Netflix. I
Oh
don't know
yeah.
if is it still on there? Yeah.
Good show.
So you can watch the process of what happened around the denial and the breakthroughs and the breakdown
Hmm.
in Osho's community in that film. And what I found is that there are a bunch of different things here. One thing is there are often cultural differences. So if the teacher comes from an
Hmm.
Eastern culture, and if it's celibate, a monastic culture, and if it's sexist, right, and if it's patriarchal, and they come to the West, and there's more self-expression, there's more sexual freedom, and there's this clash of cultures. And so for a while, people try to adjust. The members try to adjust to the teacher's trying to adjust to the West. And sometimes it's not a good fit. And there's also psychological issues. So often the systems, the institutional rules and habits that are established in the group collude with the abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So the teacher comes from a country where he's told he's a reincarnation of somebody special, and therefore he's chosen, and he comes here and he has no training in moral development, and he has no training in emotional development, right? So, and he's not aware of his own shadow material, or she is not aware of what is repressed, what is buried in his body mind, in his chakras. Shadow material is stored in the chakras in the subtle body. So it erupts, and then the community kind of explodes. So we've seen this in many, many Zen centers. We've seen this in Tibetan Buddhist communities. We've seen this in Jewish communities. We've seen it in Vedanta communities, where the teacher has some kind of narcissistic sense that he's immune to consequences.
Mm.
And he's entitled to do what he wants. And whether that is assault women, or sit on a golden throne, or coerce people to give more and more money, or demand more and more obedience. So whatever it is that's in the shadow of that student, that's meeting the shadow of that, that's in the shadow of the teacher, that's meeting the shadow in the student. Let's say the student is unaware that he has unmet childhood needs for an ideal father, to receive love and approval from a father. And he starts to believe that he can get that from this teacher. And the dynamic is kind of set up that way. And he feels more and more connected to that teacher. So then, if the teacher starts to rage, physically abuse people, that student is so invested that he can't see it. He can't believe it. And if he sees it and believes it, he can't speak up about it. He can't become a whistleblower, because the risk of excommunication and the loss of that perfect father, the loss of belonging to this family, the loss of identity, this is who I am, is just too frightening. And so it keeps people kind of stuck in place in this dynamic, in the same way that alcoholic families operate,
Mm-hmm.
where secrets are the glue that hold it together.
Well, you're basically leading a class on cognitive dissonance, and also painting a pretty concerning picture for the fragility of these spiritual communities. You know that we certainly desire. You know that little seed that's in every one of us of transcendence. That is then sought out, and but but then reconciling the humanity of what we desire versus what's real. And so modern cognitive psychologies come up with this idea of cognitive dissonance, and this is what we're talking about, that in order to resolve um, these modes of tension that exist, we just go privilege the one and deny the other, and so say, okay, great, and I'll just continue. And now I've been in a community for 25 years, and who can leave that? I mean, that
That's
you're
right.
yeah, that's it's so
That's right.
it
Or we choose the other side,
right,
which is like the cult literature
yeah,
that says this is all bad
yeah,
and you have to go back to conventional society and shut down your longing because it's
yes,
bad, right? And so what I'm trying to say, it's the subtitle of the book, The Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening. How do we hold the beauty
yeah,
and the value of these transmissions from these perennial traditions, and at the same time recognize that some people are dangerous. Some
mm-hmm.
teachers may be cognitively very well developed, like Rajneesh in his genius books, or Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in his genius books, or Adi Da, or Maharishi, who was a genius. And yet their moral line of development is really low.
Well,
It's really, yes.
my friend Jeff Kripal writes a lot about this, that the mystical does not equal the moral, and how often that's very confused because people believe the mystical is equated with the moral. And I think, speaking of psychedelics, as we were earlier, I know so many people who idealize the mushroom, for example. They take mushrooms and they think it's going to, and I say to them, the neo-Nazis use mushrooms, and the berserkers and the Vikings were using mushrooms. Like these are
Mm.
not substances that can only be one-sided and imagined to be divine. They're both, and which is actually more divine, oddly enough, than the privileging just the good. As so
Well,
many say, the demon and the angel are just differentiated by our attitude.
it reminds me of Marion Woodman, who was a
Mm.
Jungian analyst friend of mine, and she used to talk about how people project the divine onto a muffin. And the muffin, if you are a foodie and
Yeah,
you're trying to lose weight, or you have an eating disorder and you
yeah,
hold
yeah.
that muffin, it looks like God. And you have the sense that if you take it into your body, you're
Mm.
going to get the divine. It's like what's it called in the Catholic Church? The
The host,
Eucharist,
the Eucharist. Yeah.
right? So you're taking in the divine with that food or that mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very tricky to begin to become aware of what we're projecting, because a projection is a natural process. It's
Right.
always happening. You and I are projecting right now,
Totally.
but it's unconscious. It's outside of our awareness in the shadow. So, from my point of view, one of the ways we can recover from spiritual betrayal and trauma is to begin to reclaim the projections.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that we gave away to that teacher? Did we give away our own light, our own consciousness, our own essence? He's more enlightened than I am, and I can't get there without him. And I'm just, ordinary. It's like the Christian teaching, I'm sinful and the priest is not.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a splitting that's happening in that projection where I'm giving that away, and then it goes into my own shadow, right? Whatever I'm not owning in myself is getting buried into my unconscious. So when you're in part of a group, part of what starts happening is a spiritual persona develops. And you start to notice everybody's thinking alike, and everybody's facial expressions start to look alike, because you want people to join. And so you don't want to look unhappy.
Mm.
And so what happens is all that unhappiness, anger, grief is getting stuck into the shadows, getting buried, repressed. And same thing with thoughts. You know, people tell you to have positive thoughts. What happens to the negative thoughts?
Mm.
The fear, the doubt, the critical thinking. Where does the critical thinking go if you're in this kind of discipleship? Same with the connection to the body and the body's wisdom. You know, if it's flesh versus spirit or sex is bad, then the body that is going to carry the shame and is going to be its knowledge is going to be hidden from you. So
Mm-hmm.
from my point of view, we have to begin to reclaim all these lost parts of the self. And then we can begin to imagine a new kind of spirituality. We can have our agency to act on behalf of ourselves and others if there's an abusive situation. We can have our shadow awareness about ourselves. Moment of cognitive dissonance. What am I stuffing? Right? Can I let that come up for a moment? Just for a moment if it's too scary. Okay, got it. Can't go there now, you know. And you begin to learn about yourself and about the group dynamic and about the teacher. You begin to learn about it at a different level than the spiritual teachings. So, you know, the second half of the book is about recovery
Yeah.
and how to do spiritual shadow work. The chapter 5 is filled with dozens of stories of the teachers who've acted out, and the scandals and the allegations that are currently kind of in the zeitgeist. And so, you know, if people want to read about this and they're scared to, they can just go slowly and do what I'm describing. Watch their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Take a break, take a breath, right? And monitor yourself as you go through the material, because there is guidance later in the book for how to work it through.
Yeah, pay attention to the inner world. I went to and forgive me, listener and viewer, for saying this so many times, but I went to a funeral once of a person who had completed suicide, and it was in a Christian kind of Bible church that I typically don't go into, and it was pretty interesting to listen to some of the rhetoric that was happening. The preacher was saying, "Never go within, go to the book, go to the book." I mean, totally dismantling any kind of inward orientation.
Ah,
I found that so problematic. And we see it everywhere. This is a church with 30,000 people that tend to go, you know, kind of a radical reality, but very true.
don't trust yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that brings up this tension you said earlier, splitting, and I think that what we're talking about is that we're in a secularized culture that is still very spiritually yearning. And so how do we differentiate, or what did you discover about kind of looking at the dynamics between the religious life, the spiritual life, the secular life, and how to recognize how we do these projections in these various containers?
Well, you know, there's a real parallel. I didn't write about Trump in the book,
Hmm.
but there's a real parallel with the projection onto Trump
Hmm.
as the savior
Yeah.
and the group think that's going on and the complete resistance to information. And so we can see some of these dynamics playing out right before our eyes now if we start to understand them. Um, but I think there's a basic distrust of the inner world in our culture, and a distrust of the mystical
Hmm.
and of profound spiritual experience, you know, in our culture. that's been there for a long time. Maybe it's always been there, actually. It's a very extroverted
Mm-hmm.
thinking type
Mm-hmm.
culture in Jung's language. And so, but this dynamic that I'm describing is not limited to this context. So part of the reason to do this book now was because of the Me Too movement, which really explored, sexual harassment and assault in secular settings,
Mm.
in the military, in education, in the workplace, in the political workplace, right? But it didn't move, the conversation didn't move into the religious or spiritual arena. And so I wanted to look at some of those questions like consent, which was a big topic during the Me Too conversation. So, and that was in the secular setting, can a woman consent if her financial well being is in the hands of a man? So, can a woman consent if her spiritual well being, she
Mm-hmm.
believes, is
Mm-hmm.
in the hands of a man? If the man says to her, if you have sex with me, I'll raise your kundalini and you'll wake up.
Mm-hmm.
Or if he says, if you don't have sex with me, you'll go to hell and damnation. Or your family will have bad reincarnations for many lifetimes. Can she consent in that context? And so, moving what we've learned from the secular dynamics into the spiritual setting, I think is really important. And adding this dimension of the unconscious, which wasn't involved in the Me Too movement, right? But this dimension of what's going on unconsciously
Mm-hmm.
in all of the people involved adds yet another dimension to it. So, and I know you're familiar with archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
and that's yet another dimension. So if a clergy person or a spiritual leader gets caught in an archetypal possession, whether it's healer, shaman, um, knower, hero, rescuer, whatever it is, and the student gets caught in um, a child archetype or a seeker, the eager seeker, or devotee archetype, obedient child, um, then you can see from that language how the shadows fit together, right? It's like a perfect marriage. It's a way that a lot of people actually couple.
Mm-hmm.
So that archetypal dimension is also playing out in the secular world, especially with Trump. It's so obvious now, but it's not discussed. It's really not understood. Um, and again, because there's this dismissal of the inner world.
Yeah. Well, there's a I mean back to that thing I was saying about the church is that don't go within, don't understand that, don't look at it. Of course we look at this materialism, not just the financial materialism, but the philosophical position about what can be measured and observed exists and everything that cannot be measured and observed doesn't exist. And given that that's kind of one of our frameworks for consciousness, that uh, we're really underserving our potential as biological, psychological, social, spiritual beings. Which that's why I love your certainly the Jungian piece, but also your work is that it really revivifies this energy field that we've been studying for a long time, but a lot of people don't really attend to as much. I think most people that are watching or listening to this podcast do. So that's pretty par for the course in this territory. You talked about the archetype, and one thing that you wrote about in the book that I thought was important is the difference between archetypal transference and parental transference. Could you speak about that for a little bit?
Yeah. So if we're coming to a teacher with our childhood needs unmet, then we will tend to project an ideal parent that
Mm-hmm.
we never had onto the teacher. And so that's a personal psychology that we bring to that relationship. And it could be, I mean, we see that around Alma a lot, you know, people who are longing for the mother, the unconditional love of the mother, right? But we see it in less obvious ways with other teachers too. People can project a mother onto a male teacher. Um, so if the personal projection is about a parent, and the teacher at the same time has a need, unaware of, to be that parent, to fulfill that role, to be adored, to be idealized in that way, then again, those two shadows are meeting
Mm-hmm.
and there's a fit, right? If there's an archetypal projection, it's not so much rooted in the personal psychology as in the holy longing. So we might project the savior, the divine human, right? The healer, um, the complete human being, the self-realized human being. And, you know, Jung discovered the archetypal projection in the dream of a client. It's a case story about a Miss Miller.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a pseudonym or not, but he said that he realized that she was turning him into a god. And when he saw that, he recognized that there was more to projection than personal psychology, that that is a reduction to think that everything is about that, that there's something larger at work here. And so in the spiritual dimension, it's kind of obvious that we would project a God, right? We would imagine that this person is God-like. And so if it's whether it's the fantasy that that's the only person who can be my intermediary to the divine, or that's the only person who's that enlightened on the planet, or that person's omniscient, whatever it is, or that person is more compassionate than anyone else on the planet. So those are qualities of, you know, what we might call divine beyond personal, that are a part, that would be a part of an archetypal projection.
Mm-hmm. And I know this is going to be difficult to do, but when you say divine, what is it that you mean?
Well, you know, my definitions aren't really relevant. So I think that people, right? People bring their own, like I got this a lot when I wrote The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, and everyone would say to me, what is soul?
Another great book.
So we project onto these words,
Yeah. Yeah.
and part of what we imagine them to be is rooted in our own level of awareness, our own level of development. So someone who's in a very advanced level of development is going to give divine a different meaning than someone who's really in duality and imagining what it might be like.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, yeah. So, um, so you know, as a psychologist, I can say it's something beyond ego.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that transcends the ego, that we intuit is more, you know, is greater than we are. But I don't really want to speculate about the metaphysical reality of that, because that then starts getting into beliefs. And, you know, meeting the shadow on the spiritual path, I worked really hard to write it so that people of any belief system could feel a resonance.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a part of any church or sangha or zendo or, you know, synagogue to get the book. It's not written that way. It's really written in, I hope it's written in a more universal language.
I have two pathways that come up for me here. That the first is a question about, well, there there are examples, I'm assuming you have, of positive, that's a weird word to use, more balanced, more harmonious communities that are spiritual communities. So there's that. Let's just go that path. Can you explore what it is about a healthy community, a whole community that balances the light and the dark, as you say? Do you have any at all that you think of?
Well, I tell stories in the book about various communities that have gone through crises and really come out of them with different dynamics, different systems in place. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, Kripalu Yoga Center, which is a well-known, I think it's Massachusetts. Um, the yogi who started that was married and then was sleeping with some of his students.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came out, he denied it. And then another woman came out, and then he finally admitted it. And so there was this upheaval in the community around what to do. Could they still believe him and respect him and follow him, if he was telling a lie? Cognitive dissonance. So over a period of years, they brought in Jungian analysts, consultants, therapists of all kinds. They really worked on reimagining the community.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote about his new understanding of psychology and how he didn't understand that the guru disciple relationship that he learned in India didn't really work here. And they tried to kind of revamp everything with him still there. It didn't work for some reason, and ultimately he left. And they have kind of redesigned the community now to be so that it's not guru centered.
Mm-hmm.
There's another story about the LA Zen Center where the Roshi, I think he was like 100 years old, and he was having sex with all these women. And when it came out and everything fell apart, um, it really looked like everything was going to close down. And a female Roshi came in, and she actually taught shadow work. She designed the practice so that instead of meditating facing the wall, people faced each other.
Mm.
She taught communication skills. She changed the masculine feminine dynamics. Um, she's retired, but she left this in a completely different um, institutional design. I mean, she left a beautiful gift there. So those are two of the stories in the
Yeah.
book about how some communities have been able to recover and reimagine their systems so that they don't collude with the abuse. And I call that communal shadow work. So it's a little bit different from individual shadow work that we're doing privately within.
Mm. Well, I think this is where you and I really align around depth psychology providing such a potential a very healthy, potentially healthy lens through which to see and reflect on the reality of what we know we carry and what we don't want to know we carry, and just owning that. And you referenced in the book at one point Robert J. Lifton, whom I did a lot of reading in his work because I was looking at fame and the psychology of fame and the projections onto celebrity and or some of my earlier work. And I read a lot of his work on cults. It's just magnificent. And to
Yeah.
like these, just to say, viewer and listener, these are powerful, very potent communities that are large. And Shinrikyo was one of them they released Sarin Gas. He wrote about Destroying the World to Save It was his wonderful book. And they had like $1 billion arms uh, dealings in this cult, and they started as an acupuncture and yoga community that turned into this
Yes.
multinational
Yeah.
arms dealer.
There's a series now. I forget if it's on Netflix or Apple called How to Become a Cult Leader. And they have footage of him.
Oh, he's in there. Oh,
Yeah,
I'll check
he's
that
he's
out.
in it. Yeah.
Well, so let I'd like to broaden out and kind of dip into what we were talking about in the beginning when you and I were just chatting. Um, looking at the modern psychedelic community, I think the work that you do, I would say, like, flag in the sand has to be considered within these psychedelic communities, because they are within the communities. There are these compounds that are being used that are so powerful and extremely seductive to the spiritual yearning and, holy longing. What do you see in this community, and what? Let's just kind of dive into
So
that.
I had both my own direct experience of this and then also a client who struggled with this.
Mm-hmm.
So my journalism career in the 80s, my writing mentor was Marilyn Ferguson, who wrote a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this brilliant book that kind of launched New Age thinking
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And Marilyn was my mentor and became really like my best friend. We were together all of the time and highly creative. And she was brilliant and compassionate. And she started doing MDMA. And then she started doing ketamine. And then she started to, and she had actually written a book called The Brain Revolution. So she knew a lot about neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And she started to believe her hallucinations,
Mm-hmm.
that people from other planets were talking to her and telling her what to do. She started to believe that she was chosen. And so psychology, we would call this ego inflation. Instead of her ego receding to, in the context of the something larger consciousness, her ego began to get more and more grandiose.
Mm-hmm.
And she started to kind of identify with the savior archetype. And we would talk to her, we would try to talk her down. We never got through. Eventually, she was taking drugs every single day. And I was saying, and I organized an intervention. And she wouldn't stay at the retreat. And eventually, she died.
Whoa.
So it was for me, one of those turning point experiences where I recognized the fragility of the psyche. She was such a genius, and yet she could be possessed
Mm-hmm.
by, and she knew, I kept saying, this is your brain. Your brain is telling you these things, not these entities. And she just more and more got more and more lost. So it was a very painful loss for me and a teaching moment. And years later, after I became a clinician, a client came to me who was in an ayahuasca group, and she was telling me that the shaman, who was a Westerner running the group, had all the women be naked all of the time,
Mm-hmm.
made everybody do ayahuasca every weekend. They couldn't say no to it. And she was getting, she wanted to marry him. She was really taken up with the whole thing. And she reached out to me, but she wasn't open. So again, this is like a part of her knew there was danger, and another part of her couldn't make a change. And years later, she reached back to me and, kind of sent me an email about how traumatized she was and that she was finally out of the group. So, but it took her years. So, I think that all of us are subject to persuasion and coercion, and that certainly Robert J. Lifton makes that
Yeah.
clear in his work on Nazis. All of us are vulnerable to these shadow parts that are outside of our awareness, our longing, for something greater. And all of this sets us up in a way for people who may have, authoritarian tendencies or sociopathic tendencies, which I think is going on in some of the communities, because some of these people have no empathy for how they're hurting people. There's just no empathy. So it's wonderful and it's dangerous,
Yeah, it
right?
is. Yeah.
It's rich and meaningful and it's risky. And I think that if we can learn to cultivate shadow awareness, we have a better chance of really having a healthy and fulfilling spiritual life.
Well, I really want to emphasize this. It's a community that I've been exploring for a long time in the podcast and looking at psychedelics because I think ecstatic experience in the Greek, way, like getting beside yourself, engaging in these maybe spiritual behaviors that um, essentially erode away the boundaries of the ego or the typical orienting force of our lives. And then we experience otherness, and that can be really powerful and profound for our ego. So, in particular, it's the archetype of the prophet, as we were saying earlier, and we're seeing it all over the place where somebody has a singular experience and they commune with other in whatever manifestation they appear, and there are messages that are given and they're channeling, and then they become that person without any training, without any shadow work, without any mentorship, without any
Right.
collaboration and accountability. And that's certainly for all of the beauty and wonder that's happening in psychedelics and entheogens and this radical emergence of these powerful compounds in the popular culture. It is a word of caution. We need a word of caution. And I think your work really is it needs to be positioned in any community as a necessary lens through which to see not only the experiences, but the community and the leadership in the community.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I've been issuing invitations to people who are interested in what we're talking
Yeah.
about and would like to read my book in community. So I'm offering free online support groups to read the
Oh,
book together and do spiritual shadow work together
that's
and peer
great, Connie.
support. They're,
Fantastic.
yeah, they're leaderless peer support groups. And so if anybody is interested in that, you can send me an email, conniezweig@gmail.com, and put spiritual shadow work in the subject line and be
Hmm.
sure to give me your time zone. And they're all connected by region. So I will connect you with people in your time zone, and you can go through this process together, whether you have had this experience or witnessed this
Wow.
experience or just wonder about it. You can find community.
That is marvelous. Thank you for providing that incredible service.
Yeah. And
That's
they're international. So it's all over the world. So wherever you're listening, just let me know if you're interested and send me your time zone.
I'll post that too. I'll have that in the show notes. So looking at, we're coming up on our hour, and I want to be sure that we tie up any threads or anything. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you really think is important for us to include in our conversation today?
John, it's a dance of darkness and light. And it's really important not to um, completely lose faith when you meet the shadow on the path.
Hmm.
My message really is you're not off the path when you meet the shadow. It's,
That's great.
you're still on the path. It's a part of the journey. Think about the dark night of the soul
Hmm.
or the night sea journey or the via negativa. It's a part of the path. And if you get so discouraged and really, lose faith in your practice, then you're losing your connection
Hmm.
to your spiritual potential. And so I'm not arguing for that. And at the same time, I'm saying, don't be naive and think that all you have to do is meditate and it will be only light and flowers, right? So meeting the shadow on the spiritual path is an integral part of life for those of us who do spiritual work. And in some ways, it's a profound initiation. I think if we can look at it as an initiatory process, like taking psychedelics, if we set it up as an initiation and we can frame it that
Mm-hmm.
way, we can really move through it
Mm-hmm.
and out the other side.
I totally agree. And I do think that we are going to see a lot of beauty and expansion come out of what's happening in psychedelics. We're going to see a lot of really difficult, hard, uh, confusing, and overwhelming experiences too,
That's right.
without people doing their work and diligently creating the container. And I think that's one thing. And I certainly don't think that you need to be a clinician to be in that space, but I certainly think, at least in the training of becoming a clinician, you're consistently working on how you're creating the container and what kind of boundaries are in place. And I'm not yet convinced that people are clear yet in the psychedelic community about that, but I'm certainly thinking about it a lot and working hard on it. So I'm mining from your territory a lot, Connie. I'm
And are
really
you connected with MAPS?
I am. Well, I just went to the conference, and
Okay.
I don't have any connections with the folks at Maps, other than I've interviewed a lot of folks that are mining in this territory and writing in this territory, and I'm totally curious and interested at not only from a clinical perspective. Of course, we're learning with treatment-resistant depression, with OCD, eating disorders, addiction, so on and so forth, trauma, suicide, but also for a religious purpose, for people to, because I actually think when it comes to talking about God and the divine, I think other Eastern traditions do a better job of this. I think anything that we can imagine that the divine is not the divine. I think it's so much weirder and wilder than we could possibly fathom that
Mm.
it is unconceptualizable.
Uh-huh.
And I think that to me, that's a very hopefully a very healthy religious attitude that says this is inherently mysterious. I cannot contain it. I cannot speak for it. I can be
Hmm.
reverent and see how I can serve it.
Hmm. That's beautiful. The ineffable.
Yes. Yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. When you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. You know, that's
Yep.
we
Yep.
again, Western traditions don't have that. Okay, we could go on
Yep.
forever. I know we
That's
got to
right.
finish. Um, I will post your information online. I am so grateful to read another one of your
Thank
fantastic
you.
books. Your books have
Thank
been
you.
a close companion to my work, and
Oh, I'm so
yeah,
glad.
they really have, honey. Thanks a lot for what you do, and I will look
And
forward
you.
to the next one.
And thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
yeah,
We'll be in touch.
sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.
Control.